Okay, let's dive into this. We've got a really fascinating situation to unpack today. It revolves around a pretty unusual royal visit to Canada that, according to our source material, seems to carry some significant political undertones.
But we're talking about King Charles III actually being there in
Yeah.
Canada to deliver the speech from the throne.
Exactly. And apparently this is highly unusual. The source notes it's the first time a reigning monarch has done this since Queen Elizabeth II, way back in 1977.
That's the year the source gives, yeah.
Yeah.
So quite a while ago.
And our source for this deep dive, it's from excerpts of a YouTube transcript, and it doesn't just see this as, pomp and circumstance.
No, not at all. It interprets it as a very pointed political message, deliberately sent, it argues, from Canada.
It's fascinating how the source sets this up. It argues that this specific event, this rare visit, especially when you combine it with other recent sort of actions and rhetoric coming out of Canada, it signals what the source calls a recalibration of Canada's international relationships.
And crucially, the source explicitly links this recalibration to Canada's relationship with the United States under Donald Trump. That's the core focus here.
So, okay, our mission today is really to unpack what the source is claiming. We're going to look closely at the specifics, the quotes it uses, the interpretations it provides.
Yeah, to understand exactly why this source views the visit and these other actions as such a significant moment and message.
And just to be clear for you listening, we're sticking strictly to what this particular source material presents. We want to give you a clear picture of its perspective.
Absolutely, sticking to the source.
Okay, so let's start with the main event. King Charles III in Canada, delivering the speech from the throne. We mentioned how historically rare this is. The source really emphasizes that 1977 date.
It does. And the primary interpretation the source offers is, it's pretty striking. It describes the visit as specifically and surgically designed to send a strong message.
Strong is putting it mildly. The source actually uses the phrase giving the middle finger to Donald Trump.
It does use that exact phrase. The message being, according to the source, that Canada is deliberately looking away from the United States.
Turning instead towards the Commonwealth.
Exactly. Towards the Commonwealth in Europe.
Yeah.
That's the direction the source points to.
Now, this is really interesting because our source material also touches on the traditional Canadian attitude towards the monarchy.
Right. It often describes it as generally indifferent or, something Canadians don't even really kind of think about a lot, just sort of there.
But that's where, according to this source, Donald Trump's actions have apparently changed the calculus.
The source claims that this royal visit, something it says would have caused maybe uproar or just met with apathy before, is now seen by some Canadians, according to the source, as a very positive thing.
And why?
Precisely because of the message it sends. By visibly looking elsewhere for allies and, focus, it's a signal.
The source even gets into some speculation about the political strategy behind it all.
It does. It suggests that Prime Minister Carney understands Trump's psychology. The source uses the term malignant narcissism.
Okay.
And is therefore playing a smart role by using this visit. There's speculation in the source that Trump really likes this king stuff, implying Carney's leveraging that.
Interesting angle presented there. Okay, moving on. Another really key point the source highlights is this whole 51st state rhetoric from Donald Trump.
Yes, that comes up quite a bit. The source mentions his past comments about the U.S. potentially, taking over Canada.
Right. It specifically points to a never say never comment from an Oval Office meeting described in the source.
And it also recalls that public comment he made about the U.S. maybe joining the Commonwealth, where he said, "I love King Charles. Sounds good to me."
Yeah, I remember seeing that.
So the source then tries to give a sense of how Canadians, based on interviews it includes, perceive this kind of talk.
How do they perceive it?
Well, it's seen as a direct threat, a threat to Canada's sovereignty. That comes across very clearly.
Are there specific quotes?
Yeah, the source includes some from what it calls on-the-street interviews, things like, "We are a country that is sovereign, and the rhetoric from the U.S. of the 51st state has got to stop."
Okay, pretty direct.
And another person just calls him a charlatan.
Wow. And then there's the interpretation from the former MP, Charlie Angus, that the source includes. That's really strong.
Extremely strong language. The source quotes him comparing Trump's never say never stance on Canadian sovereignty to the behavior of a sexual abuser, a felon, and a criminal who can't take no for an answer. That's directly from the source.
That is quite the comparison.
It certainly is. And the source also details Prime Minister Carney's reported response to Trump on this issue during their meeting.
What did Carney say, according to the source?
According to the source, Carney was very clear, stated this is never going to happen. Canada is not for sale. It never will be for sale.
Firm stance.
Very firm. And the source notes Carney distinguished between Trump's wish and reality. And maybe pointedly also mentioned that Canada is the U.S.'s largest client.
Ah, a little economic reminder there.
There seems like it.
Yeah.
And the source's take on that whole exchange
Yeah.
is that Carney's handling was dignified and that it made Donald Trump look utterly small. That's the source's assessment.
Okay. So this brings us back then to that bigger theme. The source is pushing this strategic recalibration.
Exactly. The source really frames the king's visit as a symbolic cornerstone of this whole shift.
So the symbolism is what exactly, according to the source?
It argues the symbolism is pretty clear, reinforcing Canada's place within the Commonwealth, signaling a desire to align more closely with allies like the UK, Australia, New Zealand, the traditional partners.
And the source brings in some history, too, right? Mentioning Canada supporting the UK.
It does. It mentions Dunkirk, the Battle of Britain, suggesting this historical bond is something the source thinks Canada is now deliberately emphasizing as part of this turn away from the U.S. focus.
Okay. Are there other examples of this recalibration mentioned?
Yes. The source gives another example. Prime Minister Carney recently making what it calls important statements with President Macron of France and Prime Minister Starmer of the UK.
About what?
About the situation in Gaza. And the source highlights that Canada would normally be going to Washington to talk about this.
But they didn't, in this case, described by the source.
According to the source, no. They went to Paris and London, essentially.
Interesting.
The source also briefly touches on the idea that these Commonwealth nations aren't just, looking inward. It suggests they're forging wider alliances, too, mentioning India, China, and Africa in that context.
Okay, so building on this picture of recalibration, the source then draws a pretty stark contrast, doesn't it, between Canadian values and U.S. values under Trump?
Oh, absolutely. It's very direct. The source states, quote, "We are fundamentally different."
How so?
Canada is described as a democratic nation that believes in the rule of law. Standard stuff, you might think. But then it contrasts that sharply with its description of the U.S. under Trump. It claims the U.S. has allowed a man who attempted a coup to stay in power.
Okay.
And according to the source's interpretation of a Supreme Court stance, a man whom the Supreme Court says is above and beyond the rule of law.
And the source characterizes that kind of situation
As what an oligarch does. That's the word it uses, oligarch.
And to back this up, the source uses a statistic, right?
Right.
About negative comments.
Yeah, a specific and pretty telling statistic, if accurate, according to the source. Roughly 100 negative comments or attacks from Trump directed at Canada for every one comment questioning Vladimir Putin.
Wow. 100 to 1. That's quite a ratio presented there.
It is. And the source also tries to illustrate Canadian sentiment as it portrays it towards handling the fallout from Trump policies, like, say, cross-border trade impacts on U.S. states like the Dakotas.
And what's the perspective there, according to the source?
The perspective presented is basically, that's a U.S. problem. The U.S. needs to, and again, this is direct language from the source, deal with the felon in charge.
Okay. So not much sympathy there, as portrayed by the source.
Not really, no. And all of this feeds back into what the source presents as its central overarching argument.
Which is?
That Donald Trump represents the biggest risk, not just to the Canadian economy, but even broader than that, to the world order itself.
That's a huge claim.
It's a very significant claim the source makes, yes.
The source also tries to place this in a wider context, briefly mentioning election results elsewhere.
Yeah, it connects this idea, this trend of resistance, to figures it sees as Trump-like, to election results in places like Australia and Poland, presenting them as examples of a pattern it observes.
And it wraps up this section with a pretty blunt assessment of the U.S. position.
It does. A very bold statement. America under Donald Trump has never been weaker. That's the source's concluding thought for that part.
Okay, so let's try to pull this all together then. Based purely on our source material for this deep dive, we see a very clear perspective being argued. That these recent events, especially King Charles III's visit to Canada, delivering that speech, are interpreted by this source as symbolizing a deliberate, strategic move. A move by Canada to sort of distance itself from the U.S. under Donald Trump.
Right. And at the same time, actively seeking to strengthen ties with other allies, particularly within the Commonwealth and with Europe. That's the narrative.
And as presented in the source, this whole shift, this recalibration, it's driven by some pretty deep concerns.
Deep concerns, the source argues, over sovereignty, first and foremost,
Mm-hmm.
but also fundamental political values and perceived economic risk.
And the source attributes all of that directly to Donald Trump and his actions.
That's the explicit connection made throughout the source material, yes.
So that leaves us, and you listening, with something to maybe think about drawing only from this source's perspective. If Canada is, as this source argues, actively looking to align more closely with Commonwealth and European partners, while at the same time publicly signaling distance from the U.S., what could the long-term implications of that kind of recalibration be?
Yeah, what does that mean for the traditional alliances, the relationships we often take for granted in the Western world?
Exactly. Something for you to maybe mull over as you process the information we've unpacked from this particular source today?